Welcome to our second discussion in our Corporate Treasury Connectivity Series, sponsored by Volante. In the first session, we discussed setting up and maintaining bank to corporate connectivity. Now we're going to look at optimizing the whole connectivity process. We have a huge experience of Fiona and Nadish again, and we're going to be discussing the overall issues and how to solve them in a practical, cost-effective way. Now, Fiona, there are a whole series of issues here in terms of the impact of connectivity. Some of these are huge. What is the most important one as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think what we're seeing, very much a trend throughout the market that it's about people want to have a better visibility of their cash, their money. They want to manage it better. They want to be able to do things like pooling of their assets, etc. And so over the last few years, we've seen a lot of the large corporates that have typically been operating in 50 or 100 plus countries in the world with 100 or so subsidiaries, all maintaining their own banking relationships and feeding that information back from a cash management point of view to the head office has A, technical challenges, and B, maintaining hundreds and hundreds of banking relationships has inherent costs. So what a lot of the large corporates are doing is creating payment factories or in-house banks which are either implemented on a global basis or regionally, so that they can roll up all of those relationships and consolidate them and maybe bring down what could end up being 1,000 banking relationships around the world down to something more manageable in the tens or 100.
What's the connectivity issue within that sort of example? What's holding it back?
Well, typically the connectivity challenge is that in each country, for example, let's say it's Denmark, your subsidiary in Denmark probably has a proprietary host-to-host link, potentially with something like Danske Bank and maybe a retail bank. Their subsidiary in Norway has a relationship with DNB or somebody like that. Whereas once it's consolidated, you might want to have a regional player that you might want to consolidate because you'll get cost savings and centralized cash management services. However, the problem is that all of those subsidiaries are probably using different ERP systems, different treasury management systems. So how do you take that payment information and cash management flow going back the other way in a format that has least impact on a subsidiary? Because if you're trying to get all of those ERP systems and TMS systems changed to take some kind of data format that the central treasury requires, it's going to take forever and a day. So realistically, what you want is to be able to say to the subsidiary, send me the payments as if you were sending them to the bank, and let me do something about it to translate those into the format for our new centralized banking relationships, which may be with a different bank, but that bank would require a different format. So it's about the agility to transition your banking channels. So the corporate treasury to the banking channels was an issue that we discussed in the first part of this series of web sessions. But the same issues exist when you're trying to take the data from your subsidiaries to you as a central treasury. It's just kind of think of it as moving it down so that your subsidiaries are now the corporates and you as the central treasury are going to look like a bank to them.
So the diagram remains the same, the approach remains the same, but you're now taking the connectivity optimization into the subsidiaries. Is this how it works?
What you see here is your subsidiaries on the left-hand side. You see your banking relationships on the right-hand side. The central part, which is the central treasury, now takes all the information from its various subsidiaries, irrespective of the formats that those subsidiaries TMS systems might generate. A key point here I must stress is the usage of business rules. And that is what the Central Treasury now needs to.
What is the business rule?
The business rules are effectively the routing rules or rules by which the Central Treasury can now enable internal settlements, internal nettings, internal transfers, if necessary be, in a straight.
Is this all done within Volpay?
Absolutely. Volpay channel provides this capability now to the Central Treasury, where you can manage any incoming format and apply business rules to that to route it to the appropriate bank in their desired format. And in addition, add any internal netting or liquidity management rules that the Central Treasury might so desire to have. In addition, business rules also help you getting back the statuses, all the notices, whether it's MT 940s, 942 statements, etc., and communicating back to the subsidiaries. Essentially, what we are saying is the subsidiary is now insulated from any change. The Central Treasury is now managing the whole relationship, the formatting of any formats that arise out of the subsidiaries, and it is managing the business rules by which they want to optimize their liquidity.
But this is an important point here, that the connectivity architecture doesn't just include mapping, sending one field to another field, reformatting it, sending it off. It's also adding a new dimension, these business rules, these helping the company become more efficient.
Absolutely, and that is what the optimization of liquidity, that if possible, a Central Treasury would want to utilize the funds internally, distribute them and appropriate them allocately based on.
That normally happens in a treasury management system. How do you interact with the treasury management system?
The routing rules or the business rules that we are talking about effectively advise or manage the accounting information and the accounts that are residing within the treasury management system. So the payment files, the payments that come in, need to know what appropriate account to debit or credit and advise the treasury management system of that. The key point here is it has to be done in a STP manner, as in you cannot have operations people managing all this process. And that is where these business rules give the Central Treasury all that flexibility.
Does that include the collection, for example, of cash flow forecasts and that sort of thing from subsidiaries and centralizing it?
Absolutely. The Volpay channel includes a warehouse as well. So for example, any future dated payments, etc., are completely visible, and we provide a dashboard by which you would be able to recognize that these are my pending payments, these are my forthcoming payments, and effectively try to manage your cash flow forecasting and liquidity flows.
This changes the definition of what you do. It's far more than connectivity. It's optimizing the whole process.
Absolutely. That is the reason why Volpay channel has the capability of business rules and warehousing, because a lot of reporting, forecasting can now be achieved out of this model.
The one corporate treasurer I talked to, he was concerned by a problem where they had to extract files and then present them somewhere for a bank to come in and collect them. Is this where you do this?
Yes, this is where you would do this. More importantly, you would do this in an automated fashion, as in you would simply schedule those as whether it's reports, whether it's extracts, and pass them on to the respective bank. The business rules are the ones which the Central Treasury will set up as to decide which bank it needs to go. For example, if you have a particular bank dealing with euros, you would want to extract all your euro transactions and route it to that particular bank. Those are the kind of business rules that the Central Treasury can now operate and manage without manual work.
Okay, and so the same sort of thing could be when a subsidiary, an enterprise one, for example, was late on providing some information, would the system flag that up to the right person?
Yes, we have provided the facility for expected payments and trends as well. So effectively, you would be setting up things like particular files expected from a subsidiary, say, for example, a payroll file expected at the end of each month, or supplier payment files expected at 11 o'clock every day. Now, all these are rules which are set up, which will generate the appropriate alerts and notifications which Central Treasury can act on should they not receive those files. So there's a lot more intricacy that these business rules are now providing in this whole process. It's not just about transformation from the subsidiary format to the bank format.
The other element there is, have you got any users of your new platform, Volpay channel, and what sort of users are there? Because this seems to me it could be attractive to many different people.
We have some users of Volpay channel. The product was announced, I think it was about 2 months ago, and we've been very lucky to have a number of early adopters. We can't divulge who they are.
What type of company? What scale of operation? What are we talking?
We are actively talking to one major Swiss company which has about 90 enterprise systems across the globe and about 300 or so banking relationships. Now that client is pretty much driving a whole lot of this implementation, and we have some very good requirements out of them for the model that they wish to have. Their intention is to reconcile about the 300 banking relationships into about 30. So that implementation and that whole process is right under discussions and in progress as we speak.
One example that happens in companies is they take over another subsidiary or another company, and you get this horrendous problem if you've suddenly accepted many more ERPs. You have a process for doing this, don't you?
Absolutely, Jack.
How simple is this? It looks quite complex.
Actually, the key point here is that this is an operations-driven process. Now, normally what would have happened is once that corporate has taken over the subsidiary or the new entity, then the next thing would have been the IT systems trying to get them talking to each other. Now, we approach this as a business operations-led process where the files or the data that is generated by the new entity, the new subsidiary in this case, is simply mapped by the operations people. So effectively, again, the point is that instead of running a lengthy IT project to get the new systems talking to each other, talking to the central treasury system, we are saying that your operations can now configure those formats that the new system is going to generate. And so as you see here, the operational process is purely filling out the details of what the new formats are out of this subsidiary. And then if there is a new format which previously hasn't been catered for or is not an industry standard format, then they themselves can take the right-hand path and configure the new format, test it, and essentially deploy it within the system. So,
but they're not IT people. This is the point Fiona made in the first session, that there always is an IT element. When do you pass it over to the IT to do
it is a collaborative effort, Jack. IT is always going to be there because they need to understand what type of protocols, etc., are going to be in place. But the actual process where the code could have been written or development would have been done is actually understanding the outputs that this system is going to generate. What we have effectively done is taken that away. You should not require a development or an IT project to run this.
What do you hand to the IT department? Do this.
You hand to them the various, for example, the new systems output formats. You hand to them, they analyze it, they say that this can be configured now. So effectively the only thing that IT kind of oversees is the communication protocol, whether it's file transfers, whether it's message queues, whether it's some other channel. They need to configure and focus on those channels. The actual interpretation of what comes out of the systems is what can be configured by the business operations team.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly IT have more involvement on the right-hand side of this diagram because that passes off some of the use to IT using a component of Volpe called Foundation, which makes it incredibly quick and easy to build proprietary data formats that don't already exist. However, given that we already support and supply with the product over 90 industry standard data models, over 250 standard transformations, the vast majority are going to go down the left-hand side here. So, for example, we've already done the mapping from the entire SAP IDOC data model to ISO 20022 as what we would term in the industry technically would term a canonical or normalized data model within the product. We've also done that for the more modern XML output of SAP's ERP system, which is called a PEXR, a PEXR format, and we've also mapped all of those fields into an ISO 20022 data model. So all of that functionality is already there. So
how long would, because you're not involved in AML or any fraud prevention things, you're just taking a file or a format from one new subsidiary to a central treasury. How long would that take?
I say if they're using kind of like a standard ERP system, then I think you're talking about a number of weeks, because you still need to test these things. You need to agree that your interpretation of what they're sending you is correct, etc. But you're talking about a fairly small amount of time to onboard.
Nadish, how long would it be if you had a different process?
Normally, what would have happened is people would have written programs, people would have done development. And that is the big process we have taken out of this step. We generate automatic code through the visual models. That is why you do not require extensive programming. So anywhere from 2 to 3 months, because a software release cycle has its own journey. It can be anywhere from requirements to design, system test, user acceptance test. You're talking about 3+ months easily. But with our automatic code generation and the configuration by which you adopt these formats, we are talking about taking a big chunk out of that. And as Fiona mentioned, depending on a case-by-case basis, it could be anywhere from a few weeks to a couple of months, maybe, depending on the complexity.
Yeah, and it's also useful that when you have a project to onboard a lot of subsidiaries, and let's say through mergers and acquisitions you acquire new subsidiaries, you can actually add them in. So you've got a view of which subsidiaries have been transitioned and are wholly relying on you as being a centralized function, which ones are in process, which ones are in a queue waiting to be taken on board. And a very quick way of taking people on board is you can take the data as is and just send it as is, so that it's visible within there, so it's in the queue, but you may be, from a technical perspective, now hosting the communications, and at some point in the future you will migrate them from their existing bank relationship to one of your centralized. But what you have here is a portal that allows you to see the readiness and operational activity of all of your subsidiaries.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and the future for optimizing corporate treasury integration and connectivity is clearly getting easier and easier. In our next session, the third session on our Corporate Treasury Connectivity Series, we're going to be talking about connectivity standards and how to overcome the myriad of standards. And for that, we're going to have Fiona again, and Neil Clark, who is at Volante, is Engagement Director for Standards and Chair of a CGI MP working group. Look forward to it.
Thank you very much, Jack. I look forward to contributing to the third in the series.
Thank you, Jack.